We are tonight in chapter 9, lesson number 9. We have gone past the halfway point in our study. And so, hopefully, it's been a good study to this point for you, and hopefully you've benefited from it. I want to go through real quickly a review of what we've been looking at. And I have some extra books if we have some visitors that would want to use any of these. Andy, would you take a couple of those back there? I think that some of the ones back there with Kristen could use one. We're in lesson 9 tonight, if you want to look there. Before we get into lesson 9, we will review where we are in the Old Testament real quickly. And so I want to keep repeating this so that we get the basic timeline down and recognize how it all fits together. The very first section that we looked at was called Before Abraham Was. What happened in that section of Genesis 1 through 11? What was in there? Okay, creation. What else? Fall of man. Okay, God created man and man fell. What else? The flood. What else was in there? Tower of Babel. Okay, all of those things were there. And then after that, we have Abraham and then his son Isaac and then his son Jacob. And then, of course, Jacob had the 12 sons that became the fathers of the tribes. And so one of those sons, Joseph, was sold into slavery down into Egypt. And chapters 37 through 50 are primarily about his life and them getting his family down to Egypt. When they were in Egypt, about 400 years takes place. And what happens toward the end of that 400 years? Okay, they become slaves, and then Moses is born, and then Moses leads them out of the land of Egypt. And they come out as a nation. And when they come out as a nation, they wander for about how long? About 40 years. They go into the land of Canaan, the promised land, with who is their leader? Joshua. The book of Joshua covers the crossing over the Jordan River and the taking over of the land and the settling of the land. It takes around 7 years or so to do that. When that is over with, and Joshua dies and Caleb dies, it brings in another 400-year period, which is the period of, what's that historical period? The Judges. After that, you have the Judges. After about 400 years, the very last judge is Samuel. And Samuel anoints the first 2 kings of Israel. The first king was Saul, the second one was David, and the third one was Solomon. And they make up what is called the United Kingdom. At the death of Solomon, his son Rehoboam becomes king, and the people look for a change. They want to break in the taxes. They want a lesser tax burden because of all the building projects that Solomon, his father, had made. And they wanted a break so that they could focus on their lives and not building up the government, so to speak. And well, we know that Rehoboam didn't choose wisely. He chose based upon what the young men said, and that was to tax them more, become greater, more wealthy, and do more than your father. And the result was that 10 tribes left. Only Judah and Benjamin were left. And in so doing, what happens is you have 2 different nations. And the southern kingdom was called Judah, and the northern kingdom from then on is called Israel. And yes, they split over taxes, is what it amounted to. The northern kingdom has Jeroboam as their king. And Jeroboam as their king, he does not want the people to go down to Jerusalem to worship. He doesn't want them to go back there for fear that they'll go and stay. And so he does what? What does he do? He sets what? He sets up 2 golden calves. He sets one up in the northern part of Bethel and puts one in the southern part at Dan. And puts those there and puts a golden calf at each of those to make it convenient for them to go and worship. Well, that was, of course, idolatrous. That, of course, was completely counter to what God wanted. And the result was that they immediately, the northern kingdom immediately turned into idolatry, turned into away from God, and thus there were no righteous kings in the north. All of them were wicked. All of them were turned away from God. And so the southern kingdom of Judah had some good kings and had some bad kings. And we looked at those. We marked those in our book last week. And so the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by Assyria. The southern kingdom was taken into captivity by Babylon. And that's where we ended up last week. So, what we have tonight, the books we're looking at tonight, are Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. These are books that take place during the time, during and after the exile. There are other books in the Bible that take place during that time as well. Daniel is one of those books. And I want to take a few minutes, and the outline page I've got that we're passing out. Incidentally, on the other side, the puzzle, Ethan Wilson is our puzzle winner tonight, so Ethan's the name in the puzzle. But on this side here, this is not in our text tonight, but it's very relevant to our text, and that is in Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar, the one that destroyed Jerusalem and did the 3 deportations that we talked about at the end of class last week, he is the one that took Judah into captivity. He is the king that Daniel deals with the most in the beginning of his reign. He's the one that threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace also. Well, Daniel rises to the top of Nebuchadnezzar's wise men or whatever at this time because he interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And the dream is of a statue. And the details of that dream are largely on our outline. The statue has a head of gold, chest of arms is of silver, the belly and thighs is of bronze, the legs are of iron. And then he sees a stone cut out not by human hands, but by the hand of God. And that stone crushes the statue and becomes a mountain. And so the interpretation of that dream in Daniel chapter 2 is that Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. And a kingdom will come after him that is inferior to his, but still very powerful. And that kingdom is going to be the chest and arms of silver. And then beyond that, there is another kingdom that is going to come that is going to be the belly and the thighs of bronze. And then the other one, the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay. Now, how this gets translated into them is that over there on the side, the kingdoms that has them listed, Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. And his son, Belshazzar, is the one in Daniel that saw the handwriting on the wall. And Daniel's interpretation is, you've been weighed and measured and found to be wanting. Well, Belshazzar was killed in a takeover that night, and the Medo-Persian Empire took over the kingdom of Babylon. The first Medo-Persian king was Cyrus. And Cyrus is the one that allowed the Israelites, the people of Judah, to go back to the Promised Land. He's the one that sends Ezra and the 50,000 or so Israelites back to Jerusalem to resettle the land and rebuild the temple. So he is the one that is the chest and arms of silver. Cyrus's grandson, was King Darius the First, and King Darius the First is the one that was the one also in Daniel's reign. He's the one that had Daniel thrown into the lion's den. He's also the one that's mentioned in Ezra in our lesson tonight. And then after Darius the First, then his son is Xerxes or Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as he's called in his Greek name, is the king that married Esther, that Esther married, that we have in the book of Esther. And then his son, Artaxerxes, is the one that Nehemiah, who is the cupbearer to the king in the beginning of Nehemiah, and he finds out that his city is lying in ruins. The wall is not built around the city. And it is Artaxerxes that Nehemiah asks for the money and the time and the opportunity to go down and rebuild the wall. And so those kings are made up in that chest and arms of silver that are prophesied about. Just very quickly, they're not really related to now, they're going to be later. The Greek Empire, anybody want to, Alexander the Great, you probably heard about him from history class, from school. Alexander the Great is the one that defeats the Persians in approximately the year 332 BC. And that brings in the Greek Empire, and that's represented by the bronze part of the statue. And they go till about 63 when the Romans take over them. And it was during the Roman Empire that the church came about, and the church became greater and more powerful than the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire kind of fell under its own immorality, its own wickedness. And the church is an everlasting kingdom still in place. And so, even though Daniel 2 is not in our text tonight, it fits together some of the puzzle pieces of what we are looking at from last week, what we're looking at tonight, and what we're going to look at in a couple weeks when we look at some of the prophets. Some of the prophets will also fit into this. So, and then also, Daniel has a vision himself in Daniel chapter 7, and it is almost a parallel of the statue vision, except for it's not of a statue, but it's of 4 different creatures that he describes. One is a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a beast. And those describe the kingdoms that are coming about, and those kingdoms are described in those kingdoms as well. So anyway, thought that would be interesting for you and something important for you to have. Is there any questions or comments on that page and how that kind of relates? So that tells you where you are in Daniel, and it tells you about this post-exile time and the rest of the Old Testament age up until Christ. And the stone that came about was what ultimately became the church and what is even we're a part of today. Okay. In our lesson, in this lesson, this is probably a little more tedious a lesson than some of the rest of them because there's not as much story related to it. But I want to kind of go over it a little bit. The book of Ezra is about Ezra the scribe who goes back with the original group to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to reestablish the people there. And so he is leading them and teaching them and encouraging them to go about doing that. And he is giving them that instruction. Well, they build the temple and they restore it. The thing is, they restore it, but they're unable to restore it exactly the way it was. because the nation doesn't have the money, the gold, the silver, quite on the level that it had when King Solomon built it. And so even some that saw it said that they wept because they recognized it wasn't what the old one was. But yet all of them were encouraged and uplifted when it was finally built. And so the temple gets rebuilt. You see on page 108, he talks about the box down over there on the side. He kind of gives us an idea of what's going on. There's the construction of the temple. The ruler at that time, the original one was Darius. And that Darius the first is the same one. That's the one that's the son of Cyrus. But Darius is the same one that was the friend of Daniel's that ended up throwing Daniel into the lion's den because he couldn't amend his ruling of anybody that prayed to anybody other than himself would be thrown into the lion's den. That's the same Darius. So I just want to give you a thought just a second and pause. Just push pause on this. You've got Ezra in the Promised Land, back in Jerusalem, in Judea, rebuilding. So you've got a righteous man there. You've got Zerubbabel and Jeshua, or he's also called Joshua, and Haggai and Zechariah. But his name's Joshua or Jeshua. He's the high priest. And so you have those righteous men there. But then back in Babylon, you have Daniel. And so there were righteous individuals that were in both places. And so even though we talk sometimes about God's people having left God, there was a remnant that were still really good. You have Zerubbabel, you have Joshua, you have Ezra, and then at the same time you're going to have a couple prophets in Haggai and Zechariah that prophesied during that time. Also you've got Daniel, you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it's not too long after Daniel that you have Esther and her story. So God's people, even though they had largely left Him, there were still a remnant that were righteous and faithful and really good people that were serving God throughout that time. Over here on page 109, he mentions some of the Persian kings. Cyrus the Great was the one that took over first, and he's the one that gave the original decree. The book of Isaiah said that he would be the one to do that. It was prophesied roughly 150 years before that King Cyrus would be the one to let them back. Even before they went into exile, Isaiah prophesied that they would come back. And so his son, Cambyses, is there. He had a short reign. Don't really know much about him other than from historical records, extra biblical records. And then Darius the first, like I say, is the one that has Daniel in the lion's den. He's the one that's mentioned with the rebuilding. And then you have Xerxes, as he's called in the NIV. That's his Greek name. He's Ahasuerus in the King James, and he's the king that marries Esther. And then his son, Artaxerxes, is the one in place when the book of Ezra is written. Ezra is written a little after when it began. The first few chapters of Ezra are early on, and then there's almost 60 years later that come along that the latter part of it is. And Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries. And in fact, Ezra is mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. And so also on the bottom of the page there on 109, he has the three different builders of the temple. First, the original builder was Solomon. In the years that he roughly built that, around 957 to 950 BC. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Zerubbabel built the next one, which is where the book of Ezra is about, and built that around 536. They had to stop work because some people had tricked Darius into think they were being against God, and wrote a letter and you see that on page 109, that Tattenai, the Persian governor, was opposed to them and sent a letter, and well, Darius wrote back and said, stop building. Well, then they were able to finally rebuild, go back to building under Artaxerxes 15 years later. And then Herod the Great built when they were rebuilt at around 20 or so BC. Herod the Great's temple, of course, that's the same Herod the Great that tried to kill Jesus and when Jesus was born and all, but he did rebuild the temple. He built a lot of things. He did a lot of architecture. He was the great builder of those kings, including rebuilding and expanding the temple. And that was the temple that Jesus was in. That was the temple that would have been early in the church that Peter and John went to and such. It's the one that was destroyed in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And so, anyway. That's one of the things I like about this book, are there's little charts like that he puts in there to help us keep it all sorted out. Under the leadership of Ezra, the temple was rebuilt, and they reestablished the worship at the temple, and that was his main job. Zerubbabel was the worker as far as the governor. He was they didn't have a king, so he was their political leader, if you will. And then Ezra was their worship, their spiritual leader, and then along with him, Joshua. And then Nehemiah, when we come to Nehemiah, Nehemiah hears from his brother Hanani that the city is in ruins, the wall in particular, and he asks, he's the cupbearer to the king, and he petitions the king. It says that he prayed to God and asked the king, and the king gave him the opportunity to go to Jerusalem. He spies out the city for 3 nights in a row, looks it over, figures out what's going on with the wall, and then comes in and tells why he's there and says, let's build the wall. And they say, let's do it. And he leads the people in rebuilding the wall. A wall that's been lying down for over 100 years, and 60 or so of it while they were there, gets built up in 52 days. Takes them less than 2 months, and they've been sitting around for over 100 years, or 100 years with that wall in ruins. It's a great example of when you roll up your sleeves and get busy, you can get it done quick. They had a mind to work, is what the text says. I love the book of Nehemiah. It has got some fascinating lessons. It's got some of the best lessons on leadership you're going to find in Scripture. When you look at the description of who built what, the names don't really mean anything to you. But if you'll notice, if you read the text, most of the people did what? They built next to their house, or they built across from their house. And he gave the assignments to them when they ran around the city, and they built next to the house. You know what? If I'm part of building a city wall, where do I want the wall to be in best shape? Right in front of my house. You know, so everybody built in front of their own house because they had a vested interest in building it in front of their own house. And so you're going to do a good job if it's right in front of your house. And so they did, and they built it. They did a great job. They had detractors. They had Sanballat, they had Tobiah, they had Geshem that said, hey, you can't do this. They ridiculed them. They said, come on, let's talk about it. And Nehemiah says, I've got a great job. I've got a big task, and I don't have time. And they threatened, and Nehemiah said, God, you heard their threats. We're going to keep building. And God blessed their building, and they did it. Great, great lessons on doing what God wants, keeping with it, working hard, and keeping that busy, and just doing what you need to do. And the truth is, you go to do something good, there's going to be people to criticize it. There always are. Right. Yeah, they gave according to their ability. They worked according to their ability. So they did the best they could. There's a map on page 111 that's roughly the general shape of it. Obviously, in that day and time, the city was smaller and had a smaller area, and that's roughly the way it looked. They can't always tell because of things have been covered over and what have you, but based on the descriptions and based on the archaeology, they think that blue line is pretty well the way it looked. If not, at least it's kind of similar. So, anyway, they rebuild the walls, they get it done, and they celebrate. And Nehemiah had several different prayers, and man, that's a great lesson there. That's something one of us ought to preach, Andy. But the prayers of Nehemiah that are listed there, he prayed to the God of heaven to be able to have the opportunity to talk and do the work down there. He prayed to the God of heaven in each of those things. Each of the times they received criticism, each of the times it got difficult, Nehemiah went to God in prayer. And boy, just rich stuff, really good stuff there. It also shows about Nehemiah's faith when the people tried to go against their plans, and how God would help them, work with them, and all of those things. In the time frame, on bottom page 113, in the time frame gap between chapters 1 through 6 and 7 through 10, it's in that approximate time frame that Xerxes lived, because from 7 through 10, the primary figure there in Ezra is Artaxerxes, and of course it was his father, Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, that was married to Esther. And so the story of Esther and what took place there took place in the meantime there. Esther is a really neat little book. It is the story of God's deliverance of the people that stayed in Babylon. Not all of the people went back. Many of them were reluctant to do that because it was going to be difficult, because there wasn't a lot of resources. And so not all the people went back to Jerusalem. And so some of them opted to stay. Well, a man there by the name of Haman was going to try to kill them. He was not Hitler was not the first person that tried to eradicate the Jews. There were people throughout history, and Haman was one of them. And Haman wanted to destroy the Jews. Well, Esther was a Jew, and the story of Mordecai helping, who was Esther's uncle or cousin. The word is a little ambiguous. It's a relative. It's either cousin or uncle. Helps her realize that she's there to influence the king, and she does so and saves her people. And the one thing about Esther, what's one of the distinguishing things about Esther different from all the rest of the books of the Bible? Yeah, God's not mentioned at all in the book of Esther. The only book in the Bible that's that way. But when you look at Esther 4, when Mordecai tells her that she needs to go in to meet with the king, and he says, who knows, but you've been in this position for such a time as this. And if you don't deliver your people, God, I mean, he doesn't say God, but he'll say a rescue will come from somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah. The listing of those things. God's name's not mentioned there, but God's providence is just right through there. And like you say, on 117 is the list of all those. Tom?
One thing I didn't know I read in there too. She had to make an appointment to see the king, and that was his wife.
Yeah.
Made me think about that.
You getting an idea? I mean, Donna's not here, so. Yeah, the king, he's turning red too. He's about 5 shades of red now. the way that it was, the kings had absolute sovereignty, and anybody that came into their presence, and they didn't like the idea that came into presence, they could just simply done with you. Well, and so she took a risk. I don't know how big the risk was, because she was probably pretty popular with the king. I mean, after all, he's her queen. And he's actually excited to see her and wants to know what the request is. Ends up being, she's worried really about what ends up being nothing. And there's a great lesson there that a lot of times we worry about stuff and it ends up being nothing at all. Instead of worrying about, will he kill me when I walks in there, and he's, glad to see her. So, I think it's a great lesson. We worry about too many things. They were all praying, yeah, they were all praying for that, and that certainly is what you got to do every time you do something important in the front end of that. Okay. The key concepts on page 119. What have we got there? Let's all do these together. We don't have as many of our younger kids tonight, so I don't want to tax them too highly. We'll let them do some of the fill-in-the-blank ones. Number 1, the gallows. What's that? J. An instrument of death constructed by Haman. It's a hangman gallows, a rope, kind of thing to hang people at. Esther. D. Jewish woman who succeeded Vashti as queen of Persia. Number 3, Nehemiah. A. The empire. Okay, I will say, that's not right. The cupbearer, the king of Persia, he would later serve as governor of Jerusalem. Number 4, Messiah. F. The Hebrew term for Christ. Those are the same word, the same meaning. Cyrus, number 5. L. The ruler allowed citizens of numerous conquered nations to return to their homeland, including Israel. Okay, number 6, Haman. It is G, the man who hated a Jew named Mordecai so much he had to plot to kill all Jews. Number 7, Ezra. B, the high priest of God who came back to Jerusalem after the exile. Number 8, Sanballat. I, a Samaritan who tried to thwart Nehemiah's plans to rebuild the gates surrounding the city of Jerusalem. Number 9, Persia. A is the empire that defeated the Babylonian Empire, and of course it was defeated by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great later on. Number 10, Mordecai. E, the cousin of Esther. And like I say, some of the translations say cousin, some of them say uncle, and the meaning of that is a little ambiguous. And so he is either a cousin or an uncle as far as that goes. And so he's a relative, I guess the safest thing to say about that. Zerubbabel, number 11. H is the first governor of Jerusalem after the return from Babylonian exile. And number 12, Artaxerxes the first. C, the king of Persia who provided the Jews with all the provisions they needed to rebuild the city walls of Jerusalem. Okay. All right. On fill in the blanks, the Edict of Cyrus allowed the Jews to return home. List 2 reasons why most of them declined the generous offer. Okay, the condition of the homeland. They were going back to basically a barren wasteland. And some of them just... Well, one thing is not everybody could go in that regard. What's the other one? They had lives in Babylon. And some of them didn't have businesses. They had, lives there, and so they stayed. Number 2, explain why some of the Jews cried tears of sorrow when the temple was rebuilt while others rejoiced. Some of the oldest people remembered probably as a child seeing the first one. And because there were 70 years in between. And so only the very oldest individuals, but yet they saw it and they remembered what the old one was like. And then also I'm sure that there was some emotion in that of joy, of thinking you'd never see it rebuilt again. Number 3, immediately after arriving in Jerusalem, Nehemiah surveyed the damaged walls for 3 nights straight. Why did he do this when it was dark and not during daylight hours? Stephen?
He wanted to plan out his strategy for rebuilding the walls without the people knowing.
Yeah, he wanted to plan his strategy before everybody knew what he was doing. And that's a lot of times is a good idea, to come with a good plan. And instead of coming with a problem, come with a plan. Why did Mordecai refuse to bow before Haman even when everyone else was? Yeah, he wasn't going to bow before anybody but God. Yeah. Okay, some of the younger ones, if you'll help me on this multiple choice section, circle the correct answer. After the exile, Zerubbabel was Jerusalem's first. Caden? B, governor, yes. At first, the Jews failed to rebuild the temple. What prophets prompted them to complete it? Stephen? No. Yeah, it was Haggai and Zechariah. Ezra and Nehemiah were the books about doing it, but the 2 prophets that are listed are Haggai and Zechariah. Okay, what did Ezra read to the people in Nehemiah 8? Stephen?
C.
Law of Moses, that's right. Number 4, Nehemiah served Artaxerxes as his. Caden? A? No, he wasn't his A. It wasn't his accountant. I should have known when you were laughing not to ask you. What's the right answer, Caden? B, cupbearer. Okay. All right. Number 5, besides his faith in God, what helped Nehemiah become a great leader? His preparation skills and personal discipline. Okay. Yeah. Number 6, why was Esther afraid to go see her husband, Ahasuerus, unannounced? Jensen? B, she's afraid he might get angry and have her killed. Okay, that's true. All right, discussion questions real quick. In Nehemiah 2:4, Artaxerxes asked Nehemiah what he needed. Before answering, Nehemiah prayed to the God of heaven. His prayer was probably super quick. Have you ever prayed a very short but fervent prayer too? If so, what was going on in your life when you did? Those of us that have driven quite a few miles probably said a quick prayer in a moment or two when you felt the wheels slide or something. You know. What's that? Getting ready to eat. Okay. Rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. I don't want to give these kids any ideas. But yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay, when you're in trouble, yeah. When you got something big going on, that you know, prayer doesn't always have to be what we think of as prayer. Prayer is anything we really consciously articulate to our God. I think sometimes some of the most important prayers are even those short ones. You ever see a sunset and say, "Thank you, God"? Yeah, those kind of things. You know, help me now. You know, stay on the road. You know, those kind of things. All right, number 2, the walls of Jerusalem were ruins for nearly a century until Nehemiah came along and rebuilt them in 52 days. What was so special about Nehemiah that he was able to not only accomplish this task but do it relatively quickly? Stephen? Okay, with a good plan, with some discipline, he invigorated the people, gave them a mind to work, and they did it. You know, somebody saying they can do it, we will do it, will get a whole lot more than a bunch of people sitting around saying we can't do it. You know, they never They never erect a statue to the guy that said you couldn't do it. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Nehemiah said we can do it, and they did it. Number 3, according to Nehemiah 8, 1 through 8, Ezra read the law of Moses to the people all day long. How has reading God's Word been helpful to you spiritually? Well, I don't know if we have enough time for that, do we? It does. It helps us every single moment of every single day of how God helps us. And you know, we all probably have our own personal answers on that, but it helps us in every way and at every time. Mordecai believed if Esther failed to risk her neck, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. Did he really know this, or was he trying to motivate her? My answer is yes. I think both of them. I think he's trying to motivate her, encourage her, give her faith. And I think he also has an idea that God's not going to let his people die like that. He's not going to let that happen. So, next week, we're going to change gears entirely, and we're going to talk about the books of poetry. It's not going to be a history lesson next week. There's a little bit of history because it's about David and Solomon, but they're the writers primarily, but it is not really history next week. So, it's the books of poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And so, it'll be interesting there. So, thank you for your attention and for your input.